The laughter struck her harder than any slap. Aelia Ward stood in the doorway of the Silverbend saloon, cheeks burning red beneath the dim lantern light. Someone had pinned a wilted flower to her dress, mocking her as the preacher's plain sister. Her hands trembled, clutching her small sewing bag like a shield. The piano stopped mid-note. All eyes fixed on her, a fragile ghost amid the smoke. A drunk ranch hand grinned and slurred. "Don't she look like the backside of a mule in Sunday lace?" Laughter erupted again. Aelia turned, wishing she could vanish into the night. That's when the door creaked behind her, and the wind carried in dust and silence. Every head turned. Boots thudded slow and steady across the floorboards. The man who entered wore a long gray coat, faded by war and weather. His eyes, calm, iron, and tired, met hers for 1 second before he looked at the room. The laughter died. He was called the Centurion. No one knew his real name then, but the scar on his cheek and the soldier's medals on his chest told enough. Rumor said he fought at Antietam, that he buried too many friends to ever laugh again. He stepped between Aelia and the drunk, voice quiet but sharp. "You done?" The ranch hand chuckled nervously, but the Centurion's gaze froze him like a rattlesnake stare. "Apologize." The man hesitated, then muttered a shaky sorry before stumbling out. The saloon stayed silent. Aelia's breath caught. No one had ever defended her before. The Centurion turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here." His voice carried authority, but not cruelty. She nodded, unable to speak. He reached for his hat, tipping it slightly before walking toward the back table, the floor creaking beneath his boots. It was as if the storm itself had stepped inside, made peace, and left. Aelia fled the saloon before the whispers could follow. Outside, the air was cold and dry, the moon slicing through drifting dust. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart race. Why would a man like that, strong, silent, and haunted, step in for someone like her? She hurried down the narrow path toward her sewing shack near the edge of town. Her life had been one of quiet survival, mending dresses for women who sneered at her, stitching clothes for men who called her mouse. Her mirror was covered with cloth. She hadn't looked at herself in months. But tonight, she saw a reflection in the saloon window before she left. Eyes red, face tired but alive. For the first time in years, someone had seen her and not laughed. Yet, deep inside, a voice whispered, "Don't hope. Hope hurts." The next morning, sunlight leaked through the cracks in her cabin. Aelia threaded her needle, trying to focus on work, but her mind drifted to the man with the gray coat. She'd heard his name whispered again in the marketplace, Marcus Vale, the Centurion, a soldier who never removed his gloves, even when he paid for coffee. They said he was looking for peace but carried war in his bones. That evening, while hanging clothes to dry, she saw him again, standing by the well, refilling his canteen. Their eyes met. She hesitated, heart hammering. Finally, she stepped closer. "Sir," he looked up. "Thank you for last night." He nodded once. "You don't owe me thanks." She hesitated, fingers gripping her skirt. People don't usually step in. He paused, voice low. Most people don't see what's worth protecting. The wind carried silence between them, soft, uncertain, almost tender. She looked down, ashamed. "I'm not pretty," she whispered. He studied her for a long time, eyes tracing not her face but the strength behind her trembling hands. "That's fine," he said quietly, voice like gravel smoothed by rain. "I want honest, not beauty." Her throat tightened. She couldn't breathe for a moment. No one had ever spoken to her that way. like her honesty was something sacred. Aelia blinked away tears she didn't want him to see. He turned, adjusting his canteen strap. "Town's cruel to the gentle," he said softly. "Keep your head high." Then he walked away, boots fading into the dust. Aelia stood still, her heart trembling between fear and something new. The wind whispered again, as if repeating his words. And for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. Before the night of the saloon, Aelia's world was small as a needle's eye. She lived in a one-room shack built from scrap pine and rusted nails, where the wind slipped through the boards like whispers from ghosts. Her father had been a preacher who died believing the town would someday find its soul again. Her mother, tired, brittle, and bitter, had left when Aelia was 15, claiming, "The plain one will never survive here." Aelia did survive, though survival came at a cost. Silence. Each day she sewed dresses for the town's women. Fine lace for those who mocked her, sturdy denim for wives who pitied her. She listened, smiled, and stitched, while words like ugly spinster and mouse floated around her like flies. By evening, she sat by the window watching dust storms crawl across the plains. Loneliness became her closest companion, and even as she learned to endure quietly. Across those same plains, Marcus Vale rode alone. His horse, a gray stallion named Flint, carried both man and memory. Marcus had been a soldier once, a Centurion of the 9th Cavalry. He'd marched through rain and blood, buried friends under cold stars, and seen the kind of cruelty that burned faith out of a man's chest. When the war ended, he rode west, searching for a place that didn't echo with gunfire. He found Silverbend, a town mean enough to match his mood and quiet enough to forget his past. He took odd jobs, helped rebuild fences, repaired wagons, and slept under open skies. People called him the Centurion out of half respect, half fear, but Marcus didn't care for names. He'd learned that titles fade and truth stays. When he first saw Aelia in town, head bowed, arms full of fabric, something in him stilled, a gentleness he hadn't felt since before the war. Aelia remembered that first sight, too, though she never told a soul. She had been delivering mended clothes to blacksmith's wife when she saw him repairing a wagon wheel. Sleeves rolled, arms lined with faint scars. He worked quietly, his movements precise and patient. Unlike the others, he didn't stare at her with mockery or pity. He simply nodded when their eyes met. It was the smallest gesture, yet it stayed with her for weeks. She found herself looking for him at the marketplace, at the well, by the old oak near the churchyard. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was because his silence mirrored her own. Perhaps it was because he looked like someone who understood pain, but didn't let it rule him. Whatever it was, she never expected to speak to him. Not until that night, when laughter filled the saloon and shame burned her throat like whiskey. That evening, long before she walked into the saloon, Aelia had been asked to deliver a mended coat. It belonged to Sheriff Darby's daughter, a cruel young woman who liked to remind Aelia that beauty was a currency she'd never earn. "Maybe if you smiled, you'd scare fewer men," she'd sneered, tossing a coin into the dirt. Aelia had swallowed her pride and pocketed it. She needed the money, even if it carried humiliation. She delivered the coat to the saloon where Darby's daughter was drinking with her friends. That's when the laughter began. The flower pinned to her chest, the jokes about her face, the snickers echoing off wooden walls. She tried to leave quietly, but fate had other plans. The moment Marcus stepped through that door, something shifted, not just in the room, but in her heart. For the first time, someone had silenced cruelty with calm. Now, days later, their paths began crossing more often. At the market, he'd nod once in greeting. By the well, he'd hand her the bucket, without a word. Each meeting was quiet, unspoken, but charged with something that scared her more than mockery ever had. Hope. Still, whispers spread fast in Silverbend. The saloon women laughed at the Centurion's gone soft for the seamstress. Men joked that he'd trade his rifle for a ring. But Marcus ignored them, and Aelia tried to. One afternoon, she found a folded handkerchief on her porch, stitched carefully with the initials, and inside it, a single line written in rough pencil. You see clearer than most. She pressed it to her chest, heart trembling. She didn't know what it meant exactly, but she knew this. Something was changing in Silverbend, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of being seen. The next week brought storms, real ones. The sky over Silverbend turned copper gray, and the wind carried the scent of rain and old secrets. Aelia watched through her window as dust spun across the plains like ghosts searching for rest. Marcus hadn't come to town for days. She told herself she didn't care, that she had work to finish, but each passing sunset tightened something in her chest. When she finally saw him again, he was sitting alone by the church steps, hat tilted low, coat soaked from the rain. In his hand was a folded letter, edges torn, words bleeding into the paper. She approached quietly. "Are you all right?" He looked up, eyes hollow but calm. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice betrayed him. She didn't press further, only sat beside him in silence, letting the storm fall around them. Some truths, she thought, didn't need words to be shared. That night, she couldn't sleep. Lightning flickered through cracks in her wall, and every flash painted his face in her mind. The sadness beneath his calm, the weight he carried like armor. By dawn, she found herself walking toward the old soldier's quarters by the ridge. The door was open. Inside, his belongings were neatly arranged, a Bible missing pages, a revolver wrapped in cloth, and a single photograph of 4 men in uniform. Only one remained alive. She heard his voice behind her. "You shouldn't be here." She turned, startled, but he wasn't angry. He simply looked tired. "They were my brothers," he said softly. "They didn't come home." Aelia swallowed, unsure what to say. "I'm sorry." He nodded, eyes distant. Sorry doesn't change the quiet. His words hung in the air like gun smoke. Then he added, almost to himself, "You remind me of someone I couldn't save." Aelia didn't ask who. She could tell by the tremor in his jaw. It wasn't a name he spoke often. Instead, she picked up the photograph and set it gently back on the shelf. "You did save someone," she whispered. "You saved me." Marcus blinked, as if her words struck deeper than any bullet. He turned away, gripping the edge of the table. "You don't know what I've done." His voice was rough, defensive, yet trembling. She stepped closer. "Maybe not, but I know what you did in that saloon, and that's enough for me." He looked at her then, really looked, and something shifted between them. Not romance, not yet. Something quieter, stronger, a fragile understanding born from 2 wounded souls recognizing their reflection. The rain softened outside. He finally spoke, voice low. "You shouldn't get close to men like me." She smiled sadly. "Maybe men like you need someone who's not afraid to." The next morning, Marcus was gone. A note rested on her doorstep. "Gone south. Back in 3 days. Don't wait." But she did wait. Every sunrise she sat by her window, mending fabric that didn't need fixing. Her thoughts running like horses through fog. The townsfolk noticed. "He'll break your heart," warned Mrs. Drury at the bakery. Men like that leave more graves than promises. Aelia pretended not to hear. On the 3rd day, just before dusk, he returned, dusty, bruised, and silent. She ran to him before she could think. What happened? His expression didn't change. Sheriff needed help tracking bandits. Ended badly. He lifted his sleeve, revealing a fresh cut. Without hesitation, she guided him inside, cleaned the wound, and wrapped it with trembling hands. When she looked up, his eyes met hers, soft, unguarded. For the first time, he whispered her name. "Aelia," he said, like a prayer too long forgotten. She froze, the sound of her name in his voice sending warmth through her chest. "You shouldn't have waited," he murmured. "I told you not to." She smiled faintly. "And you told me you wanted honesty, not obedience." He almost smiled, but sorrow flickered in his eyes. "You deserve peace, not ghosts like me." She touched his hand, fingers trembling. Maybe peace isn't found by running from ghosts. Maybe it's found by facing them. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the softening of the wind through the cracks. For the first time since the war, Marcus felt something he thought long dead. Calm. Aelia felt it too. Neither spoke another word that night. But as he sat by her fire, she knew the truth. Whatever haunted him, she would not let him face it alone. The days after the storm were gentler. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and for once, Silverbend seemed to rest. Aelia noticed small changes. Marcus sitting longer at the cafe porch. Children no longer running from his shadow. The saloon pianist nodding at him in respect. But peace made him restless. At dusk, he'd ride out toward the old battlefield ridge and stay until dawn. Aelia followed once from afar. She watched him kneel beside a wooden cross, his hat pressed to his chest, lips moving in silent confession. The wind carried faint words, names of the dead. She turned away, tears in her eyes. Later that night, when he came to her door, he didn't have to explain. She simply opened it. They sat in silence again, the fire between them flickering like a fragile heartbeat. "I shouldn't have lived," he said finally. "But I did, and that's the hardest part." Aelia understood survival too well, the kind that left you hollow instead of whole. She listened as he spoke of the war, ambushes in the dark, friends who never saw morning, a village caught in the crossfire. "I was supposed to protect them," he whispered, "but orders came late." His voice cracked. "When I got there, it was smoke and bodies." He looked at his hands as if still stained by fire. They were civilians, Aelia. Children. Her throat tightened. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "You carry guilt because you cared," she said softly. "The cruel don't." He flinched as if struck, then met her gaze. "You talk like you buried ghosts too." She nodded. "Only the living kind." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with light that neither believed they deserved. That night, Marcus dreamed. Smoke, screams, the sound of rifle fire echoing across a ravine. He woke drenched in sweat, hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Aelia stirred from her cot nearby, startled but calm. "Marcus." He stared at the wall, breath ragged. "It never stops," he said. "Every time I close my eyes." She rose quietly, fetched water and sat beside him. "Then don't close them alone," she said gently. Her voice steadied him more than any prayer. He looked at her, really looked, in the dim glow. Her face wasn't pretty by the town's measure, but to him it was peace carved out of dust and courage. He took her hand, hesitated, then let his fingers rest there. She didn't pull away. Neither of them spoke again, but that silence was different, no longer the kind born of loneliness, but of understanding. Morning came with gold light spilling through the window. Marcus sat outside sharpening his knife, while Aelia prepared coffee. The world seemed still fragile, like a secret they both sworn to keep. But peace in Silverbend never lasted. Sheriff Darby rode up the path, boots heavy with trouble. "Vale," he said, spitting dust. "Bandits hit a mail train south. We need you." Marcus looked at Aelia, who froze mid-step. "You don't owe them anything," she whispered. The sheriff scoffed. "He owes the badge he threw away." Marcus stood, voice steady. "Give me an hour." When Darby left, Aelia turned to him, eyes wide with worry. "You can't keep carrying their wars." He fastened his coat, holstered his revolver. Sometimes running from war just drags it closer. She grabbed his hand, desperation trembling through her fingers. "Promise me you'll come back." He hesitated, then whispered, "If I don't, you'll know why." He rode off before sunrise, dust rising behind him like ghosts in pursuit. Aelia stood by the gate, watching until the horizon swallowed him whole. Days passed without word. At night, she sat by the fire, stitching a patch onto his coat she found left behind. On the fifth night, a storm returned, angry, wild, thrashing against her windows. She thought she heard footsteps outside, then a knock. Her heart leapt, but when she opened the door, it wasn't Marcus. It was Sheriff Darby, hat in hand, eyes downcast. "Found his horse by the ravine," he muttered. "Blood on the saddle. No body." The room spun. Her knees buckled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She simply stared into the storm, her reflection trembling in the window. The last words he'd said echoed in her mind. "If I don't, you'll know why," she whispered into the rain. "You promised honest, Marcus, not goodbye." 3 days after Sheriff Darby's visit, Aelia moved through her home like a shadow. The world had narrowed to simple motions: boiling water, mending seams, lighting lamps. She told herself work kept her sane, but every sound outside pulled her gaze to the window. The wind carried voices that weren't there. Marcus's empty chair by the fire mocked her with quiet finality. Then, one evening, while sweeping near the hearth, her broom scraped something under the floorboard. A small tin box, blackened by age. Inside was a folded paper, sealed with wax. Her name, Aelia Ward, scrawled in that firm, soldier's handwriting. Her breath caught. The wax broke easily, and the scent of dust and cedar rose from the paper. The first line made her knees weaken. "If you're reading this, I've already gone where I was always heading." His words were rough, uneven, as though written between storms. "I never learned peace, Aelia. Only orders. Only survival. But you taught me silence that doesn't hurt." She pressed the page to her chest, trembling. "If I don't come back, don't think I died chasing death. I went trying to end what haunts me." He described the train ambush, how the bandits were men he once commanded, deserters turned outlaws. "They followed me, Aelia. They blamed me for leaving them behind. This isn't law work, it's penance." Her tears blurred the ink, but she kept reading. "If I fall, I want you to remember the night you touched my hand and didn't flinch. You saw the blood in my story and didn't turn away. No one ever did that." The letter ended abruptly, as if time had run out mid-thought. She folded the letter carefully, her fingers trembling not from grief, but from resolve. "You're not gone," she whispered. "Not until I see it." At dawn, she packed a small bag, took her father's old pistol, and saddled the mule. Sheriff Darby protested when she rode into town. "That ain't your fight," he barked. Aelia met his eyes, steady, unblinking. "It became mine when he left his heart here." The men laughed, but Darby didn't. He saw something in her expression that silenced him. She rode south, following the old canyon trail, where smoke still rose faintly in the distance. Buzzards circled the ravine. She pushed forward. The land was scarred, charred timbers marking where the bandits had struck. Near the bend, she found a blood-stained badge, Marcus's, pressed into dirt beside a half-buried revolver. But no body, no grave, only silence. Aelia camped there through the night, unwilling to leave. The firelight threw long shadows against the rocks. She stared at the stars, remembering his quiet laugh, his rough hands, his way of listening without words. The wind howled through the canyon, and for a moment she thought she heard boots crunching gravel. Steady, deliberate. Her heart raced. She stood, gun trembling in her hand. Marcus, the figure that stepped into view, wore a torn coat and blood on his sleeve. His voice came low, hoarse, like a man pulled back from the grave. "I told you not to come." She ran to him before he could fall. His body was cold, his breath faint but real. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered again. "You're hurt," she said, pressing her hands to the wound. "So are you," he answered. Then, as she held him close, the storm broke overhead, thunder rolling like war drums. By morning, the rain had washed the blood away, but not the memory. Marcus lay pale beside the dying fire, his breathing shallow. "You could have left," he murmured. "Started over." Aelia brushed wet hair from his forehead. "And let the world forget you?" "No." He smiled faintly, eyes half closed. "You sound like a soldier." She shook her head. "No. I sound like someone who finally found her truth." His hand found hers, fingers weak but certain. "You said once you weren't pretty," he whispered. "But I've seen beauty in pain, and you made it gentle." Her throat ached. "Then don't die on me," she pleaded. He exhaled, eyes fluttering shut, but not before a small, broken smile curved his lips. Outside, the clouds parted, sunlight spilling across the canyon. For the first time in years, Aelia prayed, not for mercy, but for one more dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the canyon quiet as a church after a funeral. Aelia's eyes burned from sleeplessness. Marcus lay beside her, breath shallow, skin cold as the stones around them. She'd pressed her scarf against his wound all night, whispering prayers she half remembered from childhood. The fire sputtered low, but she dared not move. Every sound of wind or gravel made her clutch her pistol tighter. At dawn, she heard the echo of hooves, not one but several. Bandits. She dragged Marcus behind a boulder, her body shaking. His eyes opened briefly. "Go," he rasped. She shook her head. "If they find you, they'll finish what they started." She cocked the revolver, hands trembling but sure. "Then they'll have to go through me." The first rider appeared, a tall man with a red scarf and a cruel grin. He called out, thought the soldier had no sweetheart left. Aelia's heart pounded, but her aim never wavered. The gunfire cracked like lightning. Aelia shot first, a reflex born of fear and love. The man's hat spun into the dirt as he toppled backward. Two more dismounted, shouting curses. Marcus stirred, his voice a weak growl. "Aim low," the rocks echo. She obeyed, each shot echoing off the canyon walls, confusing the riders. One bullet grazed her shoulder, hot pain searing through her skin, but she didn't stop. The bandits retreated briefly, then regrouped. Marcus, bleeding and half-conscious. Try to rise. Stay down, she ordered. You're no good to me dead. He smirked faintly, even through the pain. Guess the command chains changed. When the last outlaw charged, Aelia met him in the open. She fired, the recoil jarring through her arm, the sound tearing through the valley. Silence followed, heavy, sacred, final. When the smoke cleared, the only sound left was Marcus's faint breathing. Aelia dropped to her knees beside him, tears mixing with dust. They're gone, she said softly. He blinked, unfocused. You're bleeding. She laughed, breathless. So are you. She tore another strip from her dress and wrapped his wound tighter, her hand steady despite the trembling. You saved me, he murmured. She shook her head. You saved me first when you saw me. His gaze lingered on her face, tracing the freckles she used to hide. You ever notice, he whispered, the world only sees what it's afraid of? You stopped letting it decide for you. Aelia pressed her forehead to his, whispering, because you taught me what honesty feels like. His hand brushed her cheek, leaving a faint trace of blood like war paint. Then don't let me die a liar. You won't, she said fiercely. You can't. Her voice cracked, but her heart refused to. By sunset, the canyon glowed with copper light. Aelia had built a small fire and boiled water, forcing Marcus to sit between groans. You should have left me, he muttered. That's what soldiers do when the wounded can't walk. She shook her head, the faintest smile tugging her lips. Well, I'm no soldier. He looked at her long, steady, like memorizing her face for the last time. No, he said softly. You're the reason I ever wanted to stop fighting. The words hung in the air like smoke. She wanted to answer, but her throat closed. Instead, she brushed dirt from his jacket and whispered, Rest. I'll keep watch. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and gunpowder away. The canyon, once a place of death, now felt still, almost peaceful. And for the first time, Aelia didn't feel small. She felt alive, standing between life and the man who refused to give up. When night fell, she stared into the embers, the crackling fire painting gold across Marcus's weary face. He stirred in his sleep, whispering names of old battles. She placed a hand on his chest, not to quiet him, but to remind him he wasn't alone. It's over, she whispered. The guns are quiet now. In the distance, a wolf howled, answered by silence. The stars burned cold above them, countless and eternal. She thought of the saloon that once made her feel worthless, of the mirror she'd turned from, of the word pretty, and how small it suddenly seemed. What Marcus had given her wasn't love born of beauty, but love born of truth. And in that truth, she found her own strength. When his eyes opened again, she smiled softly. You still breathing, soldier? He chuckled weakly. Wouldn't dare quit now. She looked toward the horizon. Then we ride home at dawn. Morning came slow over the desert, soft pink light spilling across the sand, painting Marcus's face in warmth he hadn't felt in months. Aelia stirred the embers, poured water from her flask, and pressed it to his lips. Drink slow, she murmured. His voice was gravel when he spoke. Where are we? Half a day's ride from town, she said. If the mule holds. He tried to sit, grimaced, and fell back. You can't drag me that far. She smiled, small but certain. Watch me. She packed what little they had, the revolver, the letter, a half loaf of bread, and wrapped his shoulder tighter. When she helped him onto the mule, he groaned, but she only said, Hold on. The road stretched wide and empty ahead. shimmering in heat. Each step of the mule echoed like a heartbeat through the dust. The desert didn't care if they lived or died, but she did. By noon, the sun burned cruel and bright. Aelia's hands blistered from holding the reins, but she didn't slow. Marcus swayed half-conscious, his head occasionally bumping her shoulder. "You should rest," he murmured. "Later," she said, "when we're safe." He gave a weak laugh. "You talk like a soldier now." She looked out over the horizon, endless waves of red and gold. "No," she said softly. "I talk like someone who learned to stop running." They stopped briefly beneath a lone mesquite tree. She tore the hem of her skirt to bind her bleeding palm. Marcus watched her with faint amusement. "You're bleeding for me." She met his gaze. "You bled first." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was fragile, almost gentle. For the first time, he didn't see her as the woman in the saloon. He saw her as the only reason he was still alive. Hours later, clouds gathered, rumbling low over the horizon. The scent of rain carried a strange sweetness. Marcus whispered, "If we don't make it, promise me you'll—" "Don't," she interrupted sharply. "You'll make it." Her voice wavered, but didn't break. "You've already come too far to stop now." He looked at her then, really looked. The wind tangled her hair, dust streaked her cheeks, but her eyes burned steady, alive. "You ever think," he said quietly, "maybe I wasn't meant to survive the war?" Aelia glanced at him. "Maybe you were meant to survive after it." He turned away, the words sinking deep. The rain began to fall, light at first, then steady. Aelia tilted her face toward the sky, letting it wash the blood and grit away. She'd never known rain could feel like mercy. And for the first time since the ambush, Marcus closed his eyes and didn't dream of death. By twilight, the lights of Silverbend shimmered faintly in the distance. Aelia nearly cried at the sight, not from joy, but from the weight finally lifting off her chest. Marcus stirred. "Home?" he asked. She nodded. "Almost." His hand found hers on the reins, fingers weak but warm. "You could have left me," he said again. She smiled faintly. "You keep saying that like you wanted me to." He chuckled, wincing. "Guess I'm not used to being worth the trouble." Her throat tightened. "You are. You always were." He turned his head slightly, eyes half open, watching her with something like awe. "You know what I thought when I first saw you?" "That I wasn't pretty," she said quietly. "No," he whispered. "I thought you looked honest. And that scared me." The words hung in the air as the first lantern of town came into view. When they reached the edge of Silverbend, people stopped and stared. The wounded soldier slumped against a mule, the woman leading him to the dust like some strange miracle. The same men who once mocked her at the saloon now stepped aside in silence. Aelia said nothing. She guided Marcus toward the doctor's porch, her back straight, her chin high. When the doctor rushed out, she spoke softly, firmly. "He needs a bed and a chance. I'll handle the rest." As they lifted him down, Marcus caught her hand. "Stay," he whispered. She nodded, eyes shining. "Always." For the first time, he didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a man who'd finally found his home. The doctor led them inside as the evening bell rang across town. And for the first time since her father's death, Aelia felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years: peace. The doctor said Marcus would live, but only if he stayed still, something he had never done in his life. The bullet had torn deep into his shoulder, yet his recovery was slow, not from pain, but from guilt. For the first few days, he barely spoke, eyes fixed on the window where sunlight fell in thin bars across the room. Aelia came every morning, bringing broth and bandages, ignoring the stares that followed her through town. "They're talking," he murmured once. "Let them," she said, pouring tea with steady hands. "They always talk." When she left, he found himself listening for her steps returning. Each evening, she brought a small tin of apricot preserves, a taste from her garden, something sweet to fight the bitterness of pain. He never told her that those small jars were what kept him fighting to heal. He didn't need to. She already knew. Outside, Silverbend whispered like a restless ghost. Men in the saloon said Marcus had gone soft, that he'd fallen for the seamstress who'd once been pitted. Aelia heard them sometimes through open windows as she walked home, carrying clean linens from the doctor's porch. The words stung, but they didn't cut. Once, she would have shrunk from them. Now, she only lifted her chin. One afternoon, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass. Sunburned, tired, and smiling faintly. She thought of the night in the canyon, of the rain washing the blood from her hands, of Marcus's voice saying honest, not beauty. For the first time, she didn't turn away from the mirror. Instead, she whispered he was right. Then she tied her shawl tighter and walked home, the sunset catching her hair in gold. Behind her, whispers followed, but they sounded smaller now. Marcus began to regain strength by the second week. He sat on the porch, arm in a sling, watching the horizon. Aelia joined him after his sewing work, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes telling small stories about town life. A broken wagon wheel, a child's lost dog, the gossiping store clerk. He listened with that soldier's stillness, as though every word mattered. One evening, she brought him a slice of bread spread with apricot jam. "It's too sweet," he said. She smiled. "That's the point." He took a bite, winced, and laughed softly. "You're a stubborn woman." "Takes one to know one," she replied. The laughter that followed felt strange, fragile, but real. Later, when she left, he caught her hand. "Aelia," he said quietly, "if I asked you to stay, would you?" She hesitated only a breath. "I already do." And with that, she slipped inside, her heart trembling like a flame in wind. But peace in Silverbend never lasted long. One evening, Sheriff Darby rode up with grim news. The remaining bandits were seen heading north, vowing revenge. "They think you ratted them out, Vale," Darby warned. Marcus's jaw clenched. "Then I'll finish what they started." Aelia stepped forward, voice sharp. "No, you'll rest." Darby glanced between them, then tipped his hat. "You've got yourself a keeper, soldier." When he left, Marcus turned to her. "You'd have me sit here while others pay for my choices?" "You don't owe them your blood," she said quietly. "You owe yourself peace." He stared at her for a long time, seeing something unshakable in her eyes. The same courage that had once stood against 6 gunmen in a canyon. Slowly, his hand found hers. "Maybe you're right," he said, voice low. "Maybe it's time to stop living like I'm still at war." That night, Aelia sat by the window, sewing in lamplight as Marcus slept in the next room. Outside, the desert wind hummed against the glass, carrying the scent of dust and rain. She looked at him, the soldier who had seen too much and still learned how to be gentle, and felt something fierce rise in her chest. It wasn't the fragile love of dreams. It was something steadier, born from pain and truth. She whispered softly, "You found me broken, but I think we fixed each other." His hand twitched, as if he'd heard her even in sleep. She smiled, brushing a lock of hair from her face. Tomorrow, she'd make more apricot jam. Tomorrow, maybe the town would gossip less. But tonight, she let the silence stretch between them, not empty, but full. The guns were quiet. The wounds were healing. And for the first time, the future didn't scare her. The first warning came at dawn, a single gunshot echoing through the valley, sharp and lonely. Silverbend woke in panic. Aelia was already at the doctor's porch when Sheriff Darby rode up, his horse lathered in sweat. "They're back," he said grimly. "3 riders, heading this way. One of 'em's got a red scarf." Aelia's blood turned cold. She turned toward the house. Marcus was sitting up, already strapping his revolver belt around his waist. "You can't," she said, voice trembling. "You're still healing." He met her eyes with that soldier's calm that terrified her more than anger. "They won't stop until one of us is in the ground." She grabbed his arm. "Then let it be me," she whispered. He froze, eyes softening. "No, Aelia, you've already done your fighting." He kissed her forehead, brief, tender, final, then stepped out into the burning morning light. The town gathered near the main street as the riders appeared to the dust. 3 dark silhouettes, rifles glinting in the sun. The red scarf leader spat into the dirt. "Well, look here," he called. "The Centurion and his woman." The laughter that followed was cruel. Marcus stepped forward, hand steady on his gun. "It ends here, Redden." "Oh, it ends," Redden sneered. "Just not how you think." Aelia stood at the doorway, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed to run, but she didn't. The townsfolk whispered, retreating into shadows. Even Sheriff Darby hesitated. The street emptied until only the dust remained, and 2 men facing ghosts. Redden raised his pistol. "You left us to die, soldier." Marcus's voice was low, steady. "And you chose to become worse." The gunfire that followed was deafening, a blur of smoke and thunder. Aelia screamed as Marcus staggered backward, clutching his side. He fired again, and Redden fell face first into the street. The other 2 bandits bolted, firing wildly as they fled. Aelia ran to Marcus, dropping to her knees beside him. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing her hands to the wound. "Stay with me." He looked up at her, eyes dimming. "It's all right," he rasped. "It had to end." "Not like this," she cried. "Not when we finally—" He reached up weakly, brushing her cheek. "You were the first thing in this world that wasn't ugly to me." The words broke her. "You fool," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "You should have let me fight beside you." He smiled faintly. "You did." Then his hand went still. For a heartbeat, the whole world fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. They buried him at sunset, beyond the ridge where the canyon met the desert. The sky bled gold and crimson, as if mourning too. Aelia stood alone, dust clinging to her skirts, the same revolver at her hip. Sheriff Darby placed a hand on her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. "He saved this town," he said quietly. She nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then we owe him more than a grave." That night, she sat by the fire with Marcus's letter, the one she'd found beneath the floorboard. She unfolded it again, tracing his handwriting. The words blurred, but she could almost hear his voice. "You taught me silence that doesn't hurt." The tears came, hot and endless. But beneath them was something else, not despair, but defiance. She whispered into flames, "You didn't die alone, Marcus. You never will." At dawn, Silverbend was quiet again. Aelia walked through the empty street, hair loose, face unhidden. The townsfolk watched from their windows, unsure what to say. She passed the saloon where it had all begun, the place where she'd once whispered, "I'm not pretty." Now, she looked straight ahead, voice steady. "He didn't fall for beauty," she said softly. "He fell for truth." She hung his badge on the saloon door, not as a warning, but as a promise. Then she turned toward the open plain. Somewhere out there, life waited, harsh, uncertain, but hers. As the wind picked up, it carried the faintest echo of a voice, low, calm, familiar. "That's fine. I want honest, not beauty." Aelia smiled through the tears, tightening her shawl. The story that began with shame now ended with pride. And as the sun climbed, the desert burned bright with memory and love. Weeks passed like whispers in the wind. Silverbend carried on. Wagons rattled down Main Street. The saloon doors swung again, and yet a quiet reverence hung over the town. They spoke Marcus's name softly, like a prayer. Aelia had moved to the edge of town, to the small cabin he'd once dreamed of fixing. She sewed by day and watched the horizon by night, her heart still half in that canyon where they'd laid him. Grief didn't come in storms anymore. It came like a soft rain, steady, gentle, healing. Sometimes she caught herself setting 2 plates at supper, and when she realized what she'd done, she would smile instead of cry. "Habit," she'd whisper, though deep down she knew. Some presences never really leave. One morning, a stranger came riding in from the north, a quiet young man with a scar across his jaw and a folded flag tied to his saddle. He asked for Aelia Ward. When she stepped out, his voice trembled. "Ma'am, I rode with the Centurion, back in Shiloh." He handed her the flag. "He saved my life. Said if I ever saw you, to tell you this, don't wait on ghosts. Build something living." Aelia took the flag, fingers trembling. The young man tipped his hat and rode on, dust rising behind him like memory fading into light. She stood there a long while, the words sinking deep. For the first time since his death, her chest didn't ache. It burned with purpose. Maybe his promise wasn't to stay, but to set her free. Aelia began to rebuild. She taught reading to the children who roamed the streets. She turned Marcus's old journal into lessons, maps, codes, the discipline of a soldier's mind softened by kindness. The townsfolk started calling her Miss Ward, with a kind of respect that once felt impossible. And yet, each evening, she'd walk past the saloon and place a single wildflower beneath his badge on the door. "You kept your word," she'd say quietly. One night, under a silver moon, Sheriff Darby found her there. "You ever think about leaving, Aelia?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "No, I think about living." "There's a difference." The sheriff nodded, tipping his hat. That night, she finally slept without dreams, only peace. Spring came to Silverbend, rare and soft. Flowers pushed through cracked soil. Laughter returned to the saloon. And in the mornings, the canyon wind carried the scent of mesquite and rain. Aelia stood by the ridge where Marcus lay, wearing a white shawl stitched from her own hands. "You'd like it now," she murmured. "You'd call it order out of chaos." She laid her palm on the wooden cross and smiled. "I kept your promise, soldier. I built something living." A hawk circled above, crying out across the desert. Aelia watched it soar, feeling something inside her lift too. Not the loss, but a love that taught her how to live without fear. Years later, travelers passing through Silverbend still spoke of the woman with the quiet eyes who turned sorrow into sanctuary. Some said she'd been loved by a ghost. Others claimed the old soldier still rode beside her on windy nights. But the truth was simpler. Love had just changed its form. On her porch hung a weathered sign that read, "The Honest Rest, Rooms for the Weary." Inside, a single gold watch ticked on the mantel, its hands still moving. Aelia would sometimes sit beside it, staring at the soft light through the window. "You were right," she'd whisper into the hush. Honesty lasts longer than beauty. And as dusk settled over the desert, the sound of the ticking watch blended with the wind. Steady, faithful, eternal. The Centurion's promise had been kept.